He doesn't kill everyone. He never has. Because someone has to survive long enough to deliver the message.
Welcome to Horror Audiobook.
This is not a story about a killer who hides in the dark. This is a story about a killer who wants to be known. A masked executioner is moving from house to house in a quiet American town, slaughtering entire families and always sparing one. Not by accident, not out of mercy, but to lean close, whisper a single name, and send them back into the world carrying a warning. Tonight you will follow the survivors, and by the end of this story you will understand the most terrifying truth of all: he doesn't choose randomly. He chooses deliberately, and he may already have chosen you. Chapter 1. The first survivor is not lucky, he's marked. The town of Bellmere woke slowly. It was the kind of place where morning stretched lazily across white porches and trimmed hedges, where newspaper boys still rode bikes, where doors were locked more out of habit than fear. And at 6:12 a.m., Mrs. Dalloway from across the street noticed the Hendersons' front door was open. Just slightly. Enough for the wind to move it, enough for the morning light to slip inside. She told herself it was nothing. The Hendersons had a golden retriever that liked to push against doors. Teenagers forgot to latch things. Life was careless in Bellmere. But the dog wasn't barking. It was silent. And silence in a house with 5 people and a dog is never normal. By 6:27 a.m., the police were inside. The first officer through the doorway would later describe the smell before the sight. Copper, wet drywall, something sour beneath it. Blood darkened the hardwood like spilled ink. Mr. Henderson lay near the staircase, eyes open, throat carved so deeply the white of bone glinted beneath red. Mrs. Henderson was found in the kitchen, the twins upstairs, the dog in the hallway. No signs of forced entry. No broken windows. No theft. Just violence, deliberate, controlled, intimate. And then they found Caleb. 16 years old, oldest son. He was inside his bedroom closet, sitting upright among hanging jackets, hands resting limply in his lap. His face was dry. No tears, no visible wounds. Just wide, unblinking eyes. It took 3 officers to gently pull him out, but he didn't resist. He barely breathed. At first, they thought he hadn't seen anything, that perhaps he'd hidden and been spared by chance. But when Detective Rowan knelt in front of him at the hospital hours later, Caleb finally spoke. His voice was thin. Flat. He left me on purpose. The room seemed to tighten. Detective Rowan leaned closer. Who did Caleb? Caleb blinked slowly, as if the question required effort. The man in the mask. Rowan exchanged a glance with the nurse. Trauma response. Shock hallucination. The mind protecting itself. What mask? Rowan asked gently. White, Caleb whispered. Smooth, no mouth, just holes for eyes. He watched me. His fingers twitched slightly in his lap. He watched all of us. The detective kept his tone steady. Caleb, why do you think he left you alive? Caleb's breathing changed. Shallow. Unsteady. He leaned down, Caleb said. He knelt in front of me in the closet. He could hear my heart. I thought he was deciding where to cut. The hospital lights hummed overhead. But he didn't, Caleb continued. He tilted his head like he was studying me. A pause. Then Caleb swallowed. And he whispered something. Rowan felt the temperature of the room drop without reason. What did he whisper? Caleb's lips trembled, not with fear but with certainty. Evan Porter. The name hung in the sterile air. Tell him, Caleb said softly. Tell him I'm coming. Silence followed. A normal town name. A normal town person. Evan Porter, 34, accountant, lived 3 streets over. No record. No disputes with the Hendersons. nothing that connected them. Rowan wrote it down anyway, because sometimes trauma creates nonsense, and sometimes nonsense becomes pattern. Bellmere changed overnight. Neighbors locked doors they'd never locked before. Porch lights stayed on through dawn. Church pews filled with trembling families asking quiet questions no one could answer. Who would slaughter an entire household? And why leave one alive? Caleb repeated the same phrase to every officer, every nurse, every specialist brought in to assess him. He left me on purpose. Not hysterical. Not confused. Certain. Psychologists called it survivor's distortion, the brain assigning meaning to random mercy. But Caleb didn't look grateful. He looked burdened, as if survival were heavier than death. 2 nights later, Bellmere stopped breathing entirely. At 2:43 a.m., police were dispatched to 114 Fairview Lane. Evan Porter's address. The call came from a neighbor who reported screaming, then silence. Officers arrived within minutes. The front door was closed this time. Unlocked. Inside, the scene was almost identical. Controlled brutality. No theft. No struggle beyond the inevitable. Evan Porter lay in his living room, his wife beside him. Furniture overturned but not broken, as if violence had been methodical, not chaotic. And upstairs in the bathroom bathtub, curled against porcelain like a child hiding from thunder, was Emily Porter, age 9. Alive. Shaking. When paramedics tried to lift her, she clutched the edge of the tub and screamed. Not because she was hurt, but because she thought they were him. It took 20 minutes to calm her enough to speak. Detective Rowan knelt once again. Same hospital. Same hum of lights. Same dread. Emily's small fingers were wrapped in gauze. She'd clawed at the drain hard enough to tear skin. Sweetheart, Rowan asked gently, did you see who did this? Emily nodded. The man with the blank face. Rowan's pulse skipped. Did he say anything to you? Emily stared at the floor. He told me not to cry, she whispered. Her voice cracked. He said I had a job to do. The room grew impossibly still. What job? Rowan asked. Emily's breathing hitched. He told me to tell Mrs. Alder that he's coming. Rowan froze. Mrs. Alder. Caleb's English teacher. The pattern was no longer theoretical. One lives. One dies next. Rowan stepped into the hallway, hands trembling for the first time in 20 years on the force. This wasn't random. It wasn't madness. It was a chain. And the chain had just begun. Back in his hospital room, Caleb sat upright in the dark, staring at nothing. A nurse passed by and paused, unsettled by the way he seemed to be listening. To something. Or someone. Softly, almost reverently, Caleb whispered the words again into the empty room. He left me on purpose. Outside, the town of Bellmere locked its doors tighter than ever before. But somewhere in the quiet streets, beneath the streetlights that flickered like nervous eyelids, a man in a smooth white mask walked calmly. Unhurried. Certain. Because someone always survives. And the message will always be delivered. Chapter 2. This is not random, it's a pattern. Bellmere no longer woke slowly. It jolted awake. Doors were double-locked before sunset. Porch lights burned through daylight. Parents walked children to school in tight clusters, eyes scanning tree lines and parked cars like prey animals who had finally realized they were being hunted. 2 houses, 2 massacres, 2 survivors. And 2 whispered names. Detective Rowan stood in the center of the Henderson living room, now stripped bare by forensics. The hardwood had been cleaned, but the faint outline of darkness remained like shadows that refused to leave. He replayed it again. Caleb survives. Whispered name Evan Porter. Evan Porter dies. Emily survives. Whispered name Mrs. Alder. Rowan didn't believe in coincidence. He believed in escalation. And escalation meant intent. At the station, the investigation board stretched across an entire wall. Photos, strings, timelines. The Henderson family on the left, the Porter family on the right. In the center, two small photos circled in red. Caleb Henderson, Emily Porter. Beneath them, written in thick marker. One lives, one dies next. Rowan stepped back, arms folded. What connects them? He asked the room. Silence. Officer Mendez flipped through paperwork. No financial overlap, no lawsuits, no known disputes. What about social? Rowan pressed. Same grocery store, same church, that's half the town. Bellmere wasn't big enough for strangers. Everyone brushed shoulders eventually. That wasn't enough. Rowan turned to the newest addition on the board, Mrs. Lydia Alder, age 52, English teacher at Bellmere High, divorced, no criminal history, lived alone. She had taught Caleb. She had once filed taxes with Evan Porter's accounting firm. Minor connections. Thin threads. But threads nonetheless. Rowan stared at the photos again. This is not random. It's a pattern. He could feel it. Patterns were comforting, predictable. But this one felt like a fuse burning toward something larger. Across town, Mrs. Alder sat at her kitchen table, unaware that her name now hovered on a police board like a death sentence. She was grading essays. Red pen scratching across paper. The prompt she'd assigned last week, write about fear, describe it as if it were a person. She paused on Caleb's paper. His handwriting had been unusually neat that day. Fear doesn't scream, he had written. It watches, it waits, and when it speaks, it whispers your name. Mrs. Alder felt a small shiver crawl across her shoulders. She told herself it was coincidence. Teenagers wrote dramatic things all the time. Outside, a car passed slowly down her street. Then another. Police presence had increased since the Porter murders. That should have comforted her. It didn't. At 9:17 p.m., Rowan knocked on her door. She answered quickly, relief flashing across her face when she saw the uniform. Detective, is it safe? Rowan didn't answer immediately. May we come in? Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender and old books, comfortable, quiet. Too quiet. Rowan explained carefully, about Caleb, about Evan, about the whisper. Mrs. Alder listened, lips thinning. That's absurd, she said. I barely knew Evan Porter. Barely, Rowan repeated. He filed my taxes once, 3 years ago. And Caleb. She hesitated. He's bright, quiet, sensitive. Rowan studied her. Has he ever mentioned feeling wronged, angry? She shook her head. He's grieving, she said firmly, and children say strange things when they're grieving. Rowan had heard that sentence twice now. Strange things. Trauma distortions. Random delusions. He wanted to believe it. But the ground beneath Bellmere felt unstable, like something shifting under the surface. And then the lights flickered. Just once. A brief dip. Mrs. Alder laughed nervously, storm coming. Rowan didn't laugh. Because outside the sky was clear. Hours passed. Though outside the night stayed the same. Rowan stationed patrol cars near Mrs. Alder's home. Officers rotated shifts. Windows were locked, doors reinforced. It felt excessive. It felt necessary. At 2:12 a.m., Officer Mendez reported movement in the alley behind the property. By the time backup circled around, the alley was empty. No footprints. No forced entry. Nothing disturbed. Except the back gate. It stood slightly open. Just slightly. Enough for the wind to move it. Rowan's stomach tightened. He'd seen that before. Inside the house, Mrs. Alder slept lightly. Her bedside lamp glowed dim amber. The hallway beyond her bedroom door remained still. For a while. Then, a soft creak. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just wood adjusting. Or something stepping carefully across it. Mrs. Alder's eyes opened. She listened. Nothing. Her heart slowed. Then a shadow passed beneath her bedroom door. Slowly. Deliberately. She sat up, throat tightening. "Hello," she called. Silence answered. The doorknob turned. Once. Twice. Gently. Not testing. Not forcing. Just confirming it was locked. Her breath became shallow. "Officer," she called louder. Downstairs, a patrolman stirred on the couch. But he had been drifting into sleep. And the sound upstairs was too soft. Too careful. The doorknob stopped moving. Footsteps retreated. Measured. Unhurried. Mrs. Alder waited. 5 seconds. 10. Then, a whisper from the other side of the door. Low. Calm. "You don't get to forget." Her blood froze. The whisper was not angry. It was not rushed. It was certain. The hallway fell silent again. Moments later, officers burst upstairs, guns raised. They found Mrs. Alder trembling in her bed. Alive. Door still locked. Windows untouched. House sealed. No intruder. No evidence. Nothing. Except 3 words carved lightly into the wood of her bedroom door. Small. Precise. 1 lives. Rowan stared at it, pulse hammering. Because the phrase was incomplete. And somewhere in Bellmere, someone else had just been chosen. At 4:36 a.m., dispatch received another call. A house fire on Elm Street. By the time flames were extinguished, the interior was blackened and soaked. Inside, they found a family of 3. Dead. Except for one. A teenage girl sitting on the curb, wrapped in a fire blanket, staring into the smoke. When Rowan approached her, he already knew what she would say. He knelt slowly. "Did he speak to you?" The girl nodded. Soot streaked her face like war paint. "He said," she swallowed. "He said to tell Officer Mendez he's coming." Rowan's blood turned to ice. This is not random. It's a pattern. And now the chain had crossed from civilians to police. 1 lives. 1 dies next. And the message will always be delivered. Chapter 3. The mask is not for hiding, it's a signature. By morning, Bellmere no longer felt like a town. It felt like a countdown. Officer Mendez hadn't gone home. He sat at his desk long after sunrise, staring at the words written on the board. "Tell Officer Mendez he's coming." The room smelled like burnt coffee and fear. The fluorescent lights hummed like insects trapped behind glass. Across from him, Detective Rowan watched quietly. "You understand what this means," Rowan said. Mendez nodded, but his jaw tightened. "It means I'm next." Rowan didn't correct him. Because that was the pattern. 1 lives. 1 dies next. Security footage from the Elm Street fire arrived mid-morning. Grainy. Black and white. Timestamp flickering in the corner. At 2:41 a.m., a figure entered frame. He did not rush. He did not sneak. He walked directly toward the front door. The porch light illuminated him clearly. White mask. Smooth. Expressionless. No painted smile, no carved frown, just blankness. He paused and looked directly into the camera. For 7 full seconds. Not adjusting it. Not avoiding it. Looking at it. As if aware someone would eventually review this exact frame. As if this moment was meant to be seen. Rowan slowed the footage. Zoomed in. The mask reflected faint porch light, giving it a hollow sheen. It wasn't improvised. It wasn't cheap. It was deliberate. Mendez leaned forward. He wants us to see him. Rowan nodded slowly. The mask isn't for hiding, he said. It's a signature. They pulled every database available, theater suppliers, online purchases, custom latex manufacturers. Nothing matched exactly. The mask had no seams visible in the footage, no straps. It sat perfectly against his face, like a second skin. And something about that detail unsettled Rowan more than the killings. Because masks are meant to conceal identity. But this one erased identity. It removed humanity entirely. It wasn't a disguise. It was an absence. Across town, Caleb Henderson sat in his hospital bed, television flickering silently in front of him. The news looped the footage on repeat. Blurred for public release. But Caleb didn't need clarity. He recognized the posture. The tilt of the head. The stillness. He likes the cameras, Caleb murmured. The nurse stiffened. What did you say? Caleb didn't blink. He stood in my doorway for a long time, he continued quietly. He wasn't looking at my parents. He swallowed. He was looking at me. Rowan visited Caleb that afternoon. The hospital corridor smelled of antiseptic and overwashed linens, the kind of sterile scent that tries to erase what lingers beneath. Rowan pulled a chair close to the bed. You saw him clearly? Rowan asked. Caleb nodded. He didn't hurry, Caleb said. He never hurries. Why? Caleb's eyes drifted toward the window. Because he knows how it ends. Rowan let that sit. Did he say anything else to you, besides Evan Porter? Caleb's fingers twitched slightly. He said, watch closely. Rowan's spine stiffened. Watch what? Caleb turned his gaze slowly back to him. Watch how they react. A quiet settled between them. And for the first time, Rowan understood something crucial. The killer wasn't just moving through Bellmere. He was studying it. That evening, Officer Mendez finally went home. His wife, Carla, hugged him tightly at the door. You're staying with your sister tonight, he told her gently. She pulled back. What, why? Just until this settles. She read his face. And fear spread silently between them. The patrol cars were obvious outside his house. 2 cruisers. Lights off. Engines idling intermittently. Precautions layered on precautions. But fear doesn't respect visible defenses. At 11:53 p.m., Mendez sat at his kitchen table alone. Gun laid out. Phone beside it. House quiet. Too quiet. He thought about the footage. About the way the masked man had stared into the camera. Like he wanted applause. Or acknowledgement. Mendez stood slowly and checked the locks again. Front door secure. Back door secure. Windows latched. He walked upstairs. Bedroom empty. Closet empty. Bathroom. The mirror above the sink caught his reflection. And for a split second, it lagged. Just barely. Mendez blinked. His reflection blinked half a beat later. He stepped back sharply. Adrenaline spiked. He leaned forward again. This time it matched perfectly. Stress, he told himself. Sleep deprivation. But his pulse did not slow. Downstairs. A soft knock. Not pounding. Not frantic. Just 3 deliberate taps. Mendez froze. Another knock. Even. Measured. He approached the front door slowly, gun raised. "Police," he shouted. "Identify yourself." Silence. He peered through the peephole. Empty porch. But when he stepped back, he saw it. The camera feed monitor on his hallway console. The side yard camera. It flickered, then steadied. The masked man stood directly in front of it, closer than before, filling the frame. The white mask reflecting infrared light like bone under moonlight. He did not move, did not breathe visibly, just stood there, watching. Mendez's throat tightened. "Stay where you are," he barked, though the command felt hollow. The masked man tilted his head slowly, the exact same angle Caleb had described. Then, he raised one gloved finger and pointed, not at the camera, past it, toward the house, toward Mendez. The feed cut to static. Mendez sprinted to the back door, yanked it open, gun sweeping the yard. Nothing, only the hum of insects and distant traffic. The patrol car in front remained parked, officers inside unaware. He checked the side yard. Empty. No footprints in the soft soil. No disturbed fence. Just silence. When he returned inside, heart hammering, something new waited for him. The hallway mirror. The one he'd stared into minutes earlier. Across its surface, written in thick condensation, though the house was dry, were 2 words. "Your WATCHING." Mendez felt something cold slide down his spine. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? The killer wasn't just killing. He was performing. He wanted reaction. He wanted fear amplified. The mask wasn't about hiding identity. It was about becoming something larger than a man. An icon. A symbol. A presence that could stand still in a frame and paralyze an entire town. The next morning, Rowan reviewed the footage again. 7 seconds of eye contact. 7 seconds of deliberate stillness. He leaned back in his chair. "This isn't escalation," he said quietly. "It's branding." Mendez looked at him sharply. Rowan didn't smile. "He's building something," Rowan continued. "A legend, a pattern people will recognize before he even arrives. One lives. One dies next. The message will always be delivered." And now, everyone in Bellmere knew the face of fear, even if it had no face at all. That night, as the town braced itself again, the masked man stood in a darkened room somewhere unseen. In front of him, mounted carefully on a wall, dozens of printed still images, each taken from security footage, each capturing a moment of recognition. Shock, terror, understanding. He studied them like artwork, then carefully added a new one. Officer Mendez, staring into his own camera. Watching. Chapter 4. The whisper is the real weapon. Fear screams in movies. It howls. It crashes through doors. It chases you down hallways with heavy footsteps and sharp blades. But in Bellmere, fear did something worse. It whispered. And the whisper spread faster than blood ever could. Officer Mendez did not report the mirror message immediately. He erased it, wiped it clean with shaking hands before the patrol officers outside could notice. He told himself it was condensation, a trick of exhaustion. But he knew better, because he hadn't been the one watching. He had been the one watched, and that knowledge changed a man. By midweek, the phrase had taken hold across town. One lives, one dies next. It wasn't spoken openly, but it moved through grocery aisles, through church pews, through school hallways like a draft of cold air. Students stared at teachers differently. Neighbors studied neighbors longer. Everyone calculating invisible threads. Am I connected? Am I next? At Bellmere High, Mrs. Alder returned to her classroom under police escort. Her bedroom door had been replaced, the carved words bagged as evidence. But the whisper hadn't left her. You don't get to forget. She hadn't told Rowan about that part, because that part felt personal. The students were unusually quiet that morning. Caleb's desk remained empty. Emily Porter's name had been removed from attendance sheets. Grief hovered like humidity. Mrs. Alder stood at the front of the class, red pen trembling slightly in her hand. Today, she began carefully, we're going to talk about narrative perspective. Her voice sounded thin in her own ears. Specifically, the power of voice. A boy in the back raised his hand. What if the voice is the point? The room shifted. Mrs. Alder forced a smile. What do you mean? The boy shrugged. Like, what if the story isn't about what happens, it's about who tells it? A ripple of unease passed through her. Because that was exactly what the killer was doing. He wasn't just killing. He was narrating. And the survivors were his mouthpieces. That night, another house fell silent. No fire this time. No spectacle. Just methodical brutality behind drawn curtains. When police arrived, they already knew what they would find. 3 dead. 1 alive. A middle-aged woman sitting on her front lawn, barefoot in frost-covered grass, staring at nothing. Her name was Teresa Cole. When Rowan knelt beside her, he didn't waste time with gentle introductions. He spoke to you, Rowan said quietly. She nodded. Tears streaked her cheeks, but her expression wasn't hysterical. It was stunned. He was so close, she whispered. Rowan leaned in. What did he say? Teresa swallowed hard. He said, breathe slower. Rowan felt his chest tighten. Why? He said, fear makes the heart loud. Her hands trembled. And then he told me to tell Pastor Ray he's coming. Rowan closed his eyes briefly. Pastor Ray. Another thread. Another link. 1 lives. 1 dies next. But the detail that lingered wasn't the name. It was the instruction. Breathe slower. The whisper wasn't random. It was intimate. It was tailored. Back at the station, Rowan pinned Pastor Ray's photo to the board. Mendez stared at it. He's escalating psychologically, Mendez said. Rowan nodded. He doesn't just want them afraid, he wants them aware. The whisper did something violence couldn't. It gave the victims time. Time to think. Time to imagine. Time to dread. And dread, Rowan knew, was a more powerful weapon than any blade. Pastor Ray refused police protection at first. This town needs faith, not fear, he insisted. But when Rowan told him the exact phrase Teresa had reported, the pastor's hands began to shake. Because 15 years ago, Pastor Ray had presided over a funeral. A closed casket service. For a boy named Daniel Vance. Official cause, accidental drowning. Unofficial whispers, bullying. Neglect. Cruelty brushed aside as teenage mischief. Pastor Ray had signed the paperwork quickly. Close the chapter. You don't get to forget. The whisper echoed in Mrs. Alder's mind again. And now in his. By midnight, Pastor Ray's home was surrounded. Squad cars, floodlights, officers posted at every entrance. It looked secure. It felt exposed. Inside, Pastor Ray sat at his kitchen table, clutching a Bible he hadn't opened in years. The house creaked softly, old wood adjusting to cold air. He told himself it was nothing. At 1:08 a.m., the power cut. Not a flicker. A clean, total blackout. Outside, the patrol car radios crackled in confusion. Backup generators for the street failed simultaneously. Darkness swallowed the neighborhood whole. Inside the house, a soft sound. Not a crash. Not a forced entry. A whisper. "Pastor." He froze. The voice came from nowhere specific. It seemed to move through the walls. "You remember him?" Pastor Ray's breathing grew ragged. "No," he whispered back instinctively. "No, I don't." "Yes," the voice corrected calmly. Footsteps approached. Measured. Unhurried. Just like always. Police pounded at the locked front door seconds later, but it felt distant. Muted. The back hallway door creaked open. White mask emerging from shadow. The floodlights outside flickered back to life. Too late. When officers stormed in, 3 bodies lay still in the house. And Pastor Ray was gone. No blood trail. No signs of struggle. Just absence. And on the kitchen table, written in spilled ink across an open Bible, the message was DELIVERED. Hours passed. Though outside, the night stayed the same. Rowan stood over the empty chair. "This isn't about random guilt," he murmured. "It's about a specific past." Mendez looked at him. "The drowning." Rowan nodded slowly. "Daniel Vance. A name buried 15 years deep. A death written off as tragedy. But what if it hadn't been an accident? What if someone had survived that night? Left alive? And what if that someone had decided the story wasn't finished?" Across town, in a hospital room bathed in artificial light, Caleb Henderson stared at the television again. The news anchors repeated the phrase found on the Bible. The message was delivered. Caleb's lips moved silently along with it. "He left me on purpose. Because survival wasn't mercy. It was assignment." And the whisper was the blade that cut deepest. Somewhere unseen, the masked man stood in darkness once more. Listening. Not to screams, but to the aftermath. The news reports. The prayers. The rumors. He didn't need to rush. He didn't need chaos. He only needed the whisper. Because once spoken, it never stopped echoing. Chapter 5. The town turns on the survivors. Bellmere no longer trusted silence. But worse, it no longer trusted survival. At first, the survivors had been treated like fragile glass. Neighbors delivered casseroles, church members offered prayers, news crews avoided their faces. But fear ferments quickly. And when fear has nowhere to land, it searches for a body. By the end of the week, people began whispering something new. Why them? Why does he always leave one alive? And more dangerously, how? Caleb Henderson returned home under police escort. The Henderson house had been professionally cleaned, but the air still carried a faint metallic scent beneath disinfectant. The carpet fibers were new. The walls repainted. But trauma seeps deeper than paint. Caleb walked through the front door slowly, eyes scanning the staircase where his father had fallen. He didn't cry. He didn't flinch. He just whispered softly to himself. "He left me on purpose." Outside, 2 neighbors stood by their mailboxes, pretending not to stare. "He doesn't look broken," one murmured. "He doesn't look sad enough," the other replied. Suspicion begins in small observations. And Bellmere was observing carefully now. Emily Porter wasn't allowed back into her home. She stayed with distant relatives across town. But children talk. And children repeat what they don't understand. By Monday morning, the phrase had spread through school hallways. "The survivor knows something. Maybe he tells him who to kill. Maybe that's the deal." No one knew who started it. But it grew. And once planted, suspicion is harder to remove than blood. At the police station, Rowan felt it too. The shift in tone. "Maybe the survivors are connected," Officer Briggs muttered during briefing. Rowan's head snapped up. "Connected how?" Briggs hesitated. "Maybe he's not sparing them. Maybe he's selecting them." The room went quiet. Mendez exhaled sharply. "You think a 16-year-old orchestrated his own family's murder?" "I'm saying we don't know what we're dealing with," Briggs replied. That was the truth, wasn't it? They didn't. And when you don't understand something, your mind fills the gaps with fear. The breaking point came 3 nights later. Another house. Another massacre. This time the victim was Mrs. Grayson, the town librarian. And once again, one survived. Her husband, 72 years old. He was found sitting in his study chair, hands folded neatly in his lap, eyes dry. When Rowan asked what the killer had said, Mr. Grayson answered clearly. "He told me to tell Caleb Henderson he's coming back." Rowan's stomach dropped. The chain had turned inward. Back to the beginning. News spread fast. Too fast. By dawn, Caleb's house had become a target. Not for violence. For blame. Someone spray-painted a single word across his garage door. Why? By noon, it had multiplied. "He knows. Stop the chain." And IT. Police removed the vandalism quickly, but the message had already settled into town consciousness. If the chain starts with a survivor and continues through survivors, then maybe the only way to stop it is to remove the survivor. That evening, Caleb stood at his bedroom window watching the crowd form. It wasn't large. A dozen people at first. Then 20. No weapons. No torches. Just anger disguised as desperation. A woman shouted, "Tell us what you know." A man yelled, "Make it stop." Caleb didn't react. He simply watched. Because he understood something they didn't. The message will always be delivered. It doesn't matter who carries it. Inside the house, Rowan stood near the front door, jaw clenched. "This is hysteria," Mendez muttered. "No," Rowan replied quietly. "It's contagion. Fear spreads like infection." And now Bellmere was feverish. Caleb finally stepped outside. The crowd fell silent instantly. He looked smaller in person. Younger. But his eyes held something ancient. "He left me on purpose," Caleb said calmly. A man stepped forward. "Why you?" Caleb tilted his head slightly. The same subtle angle described by every survivor. A flicker of something unsettling passed through Rowan. "He needed someone to listen," Caleb continued. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Listen to what?" someone demanded. Caleb's gaze drifted over them slowly. "To the truth." The temperature seemed to drop. "You think killing us is truth?" the woman shouted. Caleb shook his head gently. "No, remembering is." The word landed heavily. Remembering. The drowning. Daniel Vance. A name resurfacing like a body long submerged. The crowd's anger faltered. Confusion replacing rage. And in that fragile shift, a scream tore through the night. Everyone turned. Smoke billowed 3 streets away. Another house. Another beginning. Rowan's radio crackled frantically. Units dispatched. Too late again. The crowd scattered, panic dissolving accusation instantly. Because in Bellmere, survival was no longer suspicious. It was terrifying. The house belonged to Officer Briggs, the same officer who had suggested survivors might be complicit. Inside, 3 dead, and Briggs, alive, collapsed in his kitchen. When Rowan reached him, Briggs gripped his sleeve tightly. He said I should have listened, Briggs choked. To who? Rowan demanded. Briggs's eyes filled with horror. To the boy who survived. Rowan felt something shift. Not in the case. In the pattern. The killer wasn't punishing randomly. He was responding. Reacting. As if he were watching the town's conversations unfold in real time. As if he were correcting them. Briggs swallowed hard. He told me to tell Mrs. Alder, it ends where it began. Rowan's breath caught. Where it began. The drowning. The first survivor. Daniel Vance. Someone had lived through that night. And someone had waited 15 years. Later, as emergency lights painted the streets red and blue, Caleb stood alone in his darkened bedroom again. He pressed his forehead lightly to the glass. Below, police tape fluttered like fragile ribbons. He left me on purpose, Caleb whispered again. But this time, it sounded less like confusion, and more like understanding. Because the town had turned on him, just like it had once turned on someone else. And somewhere in the shadows of Bellmere, a man in a white mask stood perfectly still, listening to the fear he had cultivated. The whispers had changed, but the message remained. One lives, one dies next. And the chain tightens when you try to break it. Chapter 6, the past connects them all and it's worse than murder. By the 6th killing, Bellmere stopped asking who. It started asking why. And when a town begins digging into its past, it rarely finds something clean. Detective Rowan stood alone in the Bellmere Public Records Office, long after closing hours. Dust hung in the air like forgotten breath. Filing cabinets lined the walls, their metal drawers slightly rusted at the handles. He pulled the last folder from a box marked 2008, Juvenile Incidents. Daniel Vance. Age 15. Cause of death, accidental drowning. Location, Greywater Quarry. Rowan had driven past Greywater dozens of times. It was fenced now, abandoned, water still as oil. But 15 years ago, it had been a teenage hangout. Swimming after dark. Beer cans buried in sand. Recklessness disguised as freedom. Rowan opened the folder. Inside were statements. Short. Clean. Too clean. Daniel had slipped. Daniel had been drinking. Daniel had wandered off alone. Case closed within 48 hours. No charges. No further inquiry. Rowan flipped to the back page. Witnesses present that night. Caleb Henderson's father. Evan Porter. Pastor Ray. Mrs. Alder. Officer Briggs. The air in the records room felt thinner. Every single household targeted. Every single name whispered. They had all been there. Hours passed, though outside, the night stayed the same. Rowan drove to Greywater Quarry alone. The road narrowed as he approached, trees leaning inward like eavesdroppers. The fence had rusted over time, but a section near the back hung loose. He stepped through. The quarry water reflected the moon like a sheet of black glass. Too still. Too silent. Rowan imagined teenagers laughing here once, pushing, daring, testing limits, and then something going wrong. Or maybe something going ignored. He knelt near the water's edge. The police report had mentioned peer hazing. Briefly, a single line buried in page 4. Daniel Vance had been bullied. Repeatedly, witnesses had described horseplay. But one statement stood out now. He didn't want to jump. Rowan closed his eyes. He could almost hear it. The laughter, the chanting, the kind of teenage cruelty that doesn't consider consequences. Daniel didn't slip. Daniel was forced. And when he didn't surface, they waited. Too long. Long enough for silence to become agreement. Long enough for guilt to harden into secrecy. Back at the station, Rowan laid the file across the conference table. Mendez read it slowly. They covered it up, Mendez said quietly. Rowan nodded. They were 17, wealthy families, good reputations. Mendez exhaled heavily, and the sheriff at the time retired 2 months later. The room went still. They let it go, Mendez murmured. Yes, Rowan said. They forgot. And that was the mistake. Because someone hadn't. Across town, Caleb sat at his kitchen table with the quarry file open before him. Rowan had shown it to him carefully. Watched his reaction. Caleb hadn't looked surprised. He looked resigned. They used to call him Driftwood, Caleb said softly. Rowan frowned. Why? Because he just went along with whatever they did. Caleb's fingers traced the edge of the file. My dad told me about it once. He said it was stupid teenage stuff. Rowan studied him closely. And what do you think? Caleb's jaw tightened. I think they were scared. Of what? Caleb's gaze lifted. Of being blamed. A long pause settled between them. And someone survived that night, Rowan said carefully. Caleb nodded once. 2 people. Rowan's pulse spiked. 2. Caleb swallowed. Daniel had a sister. Mara Vance. Age 13 at the time of the drowning. Statement not included in primary file. Because she hadn't been there. She had been home. Waiting. Rowan found her name buried in a relocation record. Mara Vance had left Bellmere within months of her brother's death. No forwarding address listed publicly. No social media trail. As if she had stepped off the map entirely. But Rowan's instincts told him something else. You don't leave quietly when your brother drowns under suspicious circumstances. You leave angry. And anger, given 15 years to grow, becomes something colder. Something patient. That night, the town gathered in emergency council. Fear had matured into desperation. We have to admit it, Mrs. Dalloway said shakily. This is about that boy. Daniel Vance's name echoed openly now. The first time it had been spoken publicly in 15 years. And the reaction was immediate. Faces paled. Eyes dropped. You were there, someone accused. So were you, another replied. The truth began fracturing friendships in real time. Because remembering is contagious. And memory is heavier than fear. Meanwhile, in a darkened storage unit just outside town limits, a single light bulb hummed overhead. Pinned across the walls were photographs. Not of the murders. Of Greywater Quarry. Of high school yearbooks. Of Daniel Vance's face. And beside it, a teenage girl standing protectively close. Mara. The masked man stood motionless in front of the display. His breathing slow. Measured. He traced a gloved finger across Daniel's photograph. then down to a list beneath it. Names crossed out carefully. Henderson, Porter, Ray, Briggs, Cole, Grayson. A few remained. But the list was thinning. Justice. No, not justice. Correction. You don't get to forget. The whisper was not about punishment. It was about restoration of memory. And memory hurts more than death. Back in Bellmere, Rowan sat alone in his office. The pattern was no longer abstract. Every target connected to that night. Every whisper directed toward someone who had chosen silence. One lives. One dies next. But the chain wasn't random. It was deliberate. It followed the original circle. Except, there was something off. Daniel had died. Mara had survived. Which meant she was the first one left alive. Rowan leaned back slowly. Because if she had returned, if she had watched Bellmere from a distance for years, if she had planned, then this wasn't the work of someone who snapped. This was the work of someone who waited. 15 years of waiting. And somewhere in the darkness of Bellmere's outskirts, a white mask rested against bare concrete. Not discarded. Not hidden. Displayed. Because the mask wasn't about hiding identity. It was about becoming something the town could never forget. A symbol. A memory carved into wood. One lives. One dies next. And the past always resurfaces. Like a body rising slowly through black water. Chapter 7, he doesn't want justice, he wants fear. By the 7th killing, Bellmere understood something crucial. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is loud, emotional, messy. This was methodical. And methodical cruelty is colder than rage. The remaining names from Greywater Quarry had gone into hiding. 2 had left town entirely. 1 barricaded himself inside his lake house with private security. But fear travels faster than cars. And it slips through locks. Rowan stood in front of the board again, studying the shrinking list. Only 3 names remained connected to that night. Harold Finch, Nadine Keller, and Sheriff Alan Crow, retired. Crow had overseen the original drowning report. Signed off on accidental. Closed the file. Rowan felt the weight of that decision now. Because someone had never accepted it. The next target wasn't subtle. Harold Finch hosted a press conference in his driveway. He was pale, sweating despite the autumn chill. I was a child, he insisted into cameras. We all were, it was an accident. Rowan watched from the edge of the crowd. Something about Finch's urgency felt wrong. It wasn't remorse. It was self-preservation. And that night, the masked man arrived earlier than expected. 8:42 p.m. Broad daylight fading into evening. Finch's security cameras caught him approaching openly down the gravel driveway. No hurry. No stealth. The guards shouted. Drew weapons. The masked man didn't flinch. He simply raised his hand slowly. Empty. The guards hesitated. And in that hesitation, the power to the property cut completely. Darkness swallowed the estate. Gunshots rang out. 3 guards fell within seconds. Efficient. Precise. No wasted motion. Inside the house, Finch screamed. Not when the masked man entered. Not when he saw the blade. But when he heard the voice. You remember, the masked man whispered calmly. Finch sobbed, we were kids. You remember, the voice repeated. The whisper wasn't angry. It was disappointed. Moments later, the house fell silent. When police arrived, they found Harold Finch dead in his study. But this time, there was no survivor in the house. Rowan's pulse raced. The pattern broken. No, because outside, sitting calmly on the hood of a police cruiser, was Nadine Keller. Alive. Unharmed. She hadn't lived there. She hadn't been invited. Yet she was present. And when Rowan approached her, she looked almost relieved. "He told me to come," she said quietly. Rowan's blood ran cold. "He contacted you." She nodded. "A letter, no return address." She swallowed. "He said if I wanted to survive, I should watch." Rowan stared at her. "And you came." Her lips trembled. "I wanted to know if he remembered." The air shifted. "He remembered everything," she whispered. This wasn't revenge. It was theater. He wasn't killing in secret anymore. He was orchestrating fear publicly, making them confront it, making them anticipate it. Because anticipation is torture. And torture lingers. Back at the station, Rowan replayed the Finch footage again. Frame by frame, the masked man moved with controlled precision. Never rushing. Never chaotic. Every motion measured. "He's not improvising," Mendez muttered. "No," Rowan agreed. "He's teaching." The room went quiet. Because that was the truth. Each killing was a lesson. Each whisper a reminder. You don't get to forget. Sheriff Alan Crow didn't wait for protection. He came to Rowan himself. The retired sheriff looked smaller than his reputation. Age had folded him inward. "I made a call," Crow admitted. "It was political, the town was fragile." Rowan didn't blink. "And a boy died." Crow closed his eyes. "Yes." "Do you remember what he looked like?" Rowan asked quietly. Crow hesitated, then nodded. Wide-eyed, like he was waiting for someone to stop it. Rowan felt a chill. Because that detail had never been in the official file. Crow wasn't remembering facts. He was remembering guilt. That night, Crow locked himself inside his home. No cameras. No guards. Just an old revolver and a house filled with regret. At 1:13 a.m. the phone rang. Crow answered immediately. Silence. Then, breathing. Slow. Measured. "You remember," the voice whispered. Crow's grip tightened. "Yes," he said. A pause. "Good." The line went dead. Crow waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. Relief crept in cautiously. Maybe confession was enough. Maybe acknowledgement broke the chain. He lowered the revolver slightly. And then, a knock at the door. Not pounding. Not violent. 3 even taps. Crow didn't hesitate this time. He opened the door himself. The masked man stood there. Still. Silent. Crow raised the revolver. His hands didn't shake. "You got what you wanted," Crow said. "Memory," the masked voice replied. "Then why are you here?" A slight tilt of the head. "Because fear spreads." The blade flashed once. Clean. Efficient. When officers arrived minutes later, Crow was dead. And sitting calmly at the kitchen table was Nadine Keller. Alive. Again. Rowan felt something fracture internally. "You weren't here before," he said slowly. Nadine nodded. "He told me to come again." Her voice trembled now. "He said I needed to see how it ends." Rowan leaned closer. "What else did he say?" Tears filled her eyes. "He said justice fades, but fear lasts." And there it was. Not justice. Not revenge. Fear. He wanted the town unraveling, turning on itself, remembering not with closure, but with terror. Across Bellmere, neighbors no longer spoke openly. They watched each other through curtains. Parents warned children not to trust anyone. Old friendships collapsed under suspicion. The killer had achieved something larger than death. He had rewritten the town's identity. Bellmere was no longer peaceful. It was complicit, and complicit towns rot from within. Later that night, Nadine sat alone in a hospital bed. Alive. Again. She stared at the ceiling. "He left me on purpose," she whispered. The phrase had changed shape. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was understanding. She wasn't spared. She was chosen. And somewhere in the darkness, the masked man stood before his shrinking list. Only one name remained uncrossed. Mara Vance. He traced it slowly with his gloved finger. Because this had never been about finishing a list. It had been about preparing the final act. Fear spreads. Memory lingers. And the last survivor must decide what comes next. Chapter 8. The Survivor Who Refuses to Run. By the 8th chapter of Bellmere's unraveling, something unexpected happened. The chain hesitated. Not because there were no names left, but because the final name refused to hide. Mara Vance returned to Bellmere in daylight. No disguise, no secrecy, no escort. She walked off the afternoon bus with a single duffel bag slung over her shoulder, autumn wind tugging at her dark hair. The town square fell quiet when people recognized her face, older now, sharper, but unmistakable. Daniel Vance's sister. The first survivor. 15 years ago, she had stood at Greywater Quarry's edge, screaming into black water while men in varsity jackets avoided her eyes. Now she stood in the center of town, steady, present, and unafraid. Detective Rowan met her outside the station. "You knew we'd connect it back to Greywater," he said carefully. Mara nodded. "I hoped you would." Her voice was calm, not hollow like Caleb's, not trembling like Nadine's. It carried something heavier. Expectation. "You're aware you're the last name left," Rowan said. She met his gaze directly. "Yes. And you came back anyway." A faint, almost humorless smile touched her lips. "I'm tired of running from something that already lives here." Rowan studied her closely. "You think he's avenging Daniel?" Mara's eyes flickered. "No," she said softly. "I think he's making sure they remember him." Hours passed, though outside, the town did not breathe normally. Rumors erupted instantly. She came back to finish it. She brought him. She is him. Fear reshapes facts. By evening, Myra rented a small room above the old hardware store, a place that overlooked the square. She didn't request police protection. She didn't lock the door more than once. Instead, she unpacked a single photograph and placed it on the nightstand. Daniel, 14 years old, smiling too wide, trusting. "You don't get to forget," she whispered. But there was no bitterness in her tone. Only sorrow. That night the power did not cut. No doors creaked. No alarms failed. The knock came at 10:03 p.m. 3 even taps. Myra didn't jump. She didn't hesitate. She walked calmly to the door and opened it. The masked man stood there. Still, white surface catching the dim hallway light. For a long moment, neither moved. "You're late," Mara said quietly. The mask tilted slightly. "You weren't supposed to survive that night," the voice replied. Mara's breath did not change. "Neither were you." Silence stretched between them. A shared history filling the air. You could have left, he said. I did, she answered. You stayed. A subtle shift. I stayed to remember. And to punish, she added. A pause. Yes. The honesty was chilling. Not rage. Not denial. Just certainty. Mara stepped back slightly, allowing him into the room. He entered without touching her, without raising the blade at his side. The room felt smaller with him inside it. You've made them afraid, she said. They were afraid that night too, he replied. Of being caught. Mara's eyes hardened. You're not bringing Daniel back. The mask did not move. No. Then what are you doing? A soft inhale behind the mask, making sure no one forgets how he sounded. Her throat tightened slightly. You remember his voice. Yes. And that's why you leave one alive, she realized. To carry it. The masked man stood motionless. He left me on purpose, Mara whispered, understanding fully now. The first survivor. Him. 15 years ago. When Daniel went under, someone had watched. Someone had hesitated. Someone had lived. And that someone had been forced to carry the sound of it ever since. You think fear is the only thing that lasts, Mara said. It does, he replied calmly. No, she said softly. Stories do. Silence again. The blade remained low. He had not come to kill her. Not yet. You're the end of the list, he said. Yes. And if I leave you alive. Her heartbeat slowed. Then the chain ends. The room felt suspended in time. Or, he countered quietly, you continue it. That was the real choice. Not survival. Responsibility. The whisper wasn't a weapon. It was a transfer. One lives. One decides what happens next. Down below, Detective Rowan sat in his parked cruiser, staring up at the hardware store window. He didn't know why he felt drawn there. Instinct. The air felt charged. He stepped out of the vehicle slowly. Above him, a light flickered. Then steadied. He climbed the stairs quietly. The hallway was empty. Mara's door stood slightly open. Just slightly. Enough for the wind to move it. Rowan's pulse quickened. He pushed it open fully. The room was empty. No struggle. No blood. Just the photograph of Daniel on the nightstand. And beneath it, a note written in careful, deliberate ink. One lives. Rowan's chest tightened. Because for the first time, the phrase felt unfinished. Outside town limits near Greywater Quarry, two figures stood at the water's edge. The masked man. And Mara. The water was still. Black. Unmoving. This is where it began, he said quietly. No, Mara replied. It began long before this. She stepped closer to the water. You've made them afraid. Yes. They'll remember. Yes. And now. The masked man looked at her slowly. Now you choose. The wind rippled the surface slightly. Mara closed her eyes. For 15 years, she had imagined this moment differently. Screaming. Rage. Violence. But what stood beside her wasn't fury. It was grief turned ritual. You don't get to forget, she whispered. The masked man lowered the blade slightly. And for the first time, he hesitated. Behind them, unseen in the darkness, Rowan watched. Gun steady. Breathing shallow. The chain had paused. But it had not broken. Because whether the blade fell, or whether it didn't, someone would survive. And someone would carry the whisper. Chapter 9. The Final Chain Reaction. Greywater Quarry had always looked deeper at night. The surface of the water reflected nothing now. Not the moon, not the trees, not the three figures standing at its edge. Mara, the masked man, and several yards behind them, Detective Rowan, gun raised, breath controlled, heart pounding like something trapped. For a long moment, no one moved. The world had narrowed to black water and unfinished sentences. "You hesitated," Mara said quietly. The masked man stood motionless beside her. The blade in his gloved hand caught faint starlight. "Yes." "Why?" Silence stretched. "Then, because you remember him differently than I do." That answer hung heavy. Rowan stepped closer, boots crunching softly on gravel. "It's over," he called out, voice steady but low. "Drop it." The masked man didn't turn, didn't flinch. Mara didn't look back either. "You think this ends with arrest?" she asked Rowan calmly. "It ends tonight," Rowan replied. "It ends when someone chooses to stop." The wind shifted. The quarry water rippled slightly, the first movement Rowan had seen. The masked man finally spoke again. "I didn't push him." Mara's breath caught. Rowan felt something crack open inside the silence. "You didn't stop them," she said. "No." The word wasn't defensive. It was factual. "I was closest to the edge," he continued. "They were laughing, chanting, he was crying." Mara's hands trembled at her sides. "And you watched?" "Yes." Rowan's mind raced. The first survivor. Not Mara. Not Daniel. Him. The boy who had stood close enough to hear Daniel's voice as it went under. The boy who had lived with that sound for 15 years. "You left me alive," Mara whispered. "Yes." "Why?" The mask turned slightly toward her. "Because you screamed." Her breath hitched. "You didn't freeze," he said. "You didn't laugh, you tried to reach him." The quarry felt colder suddenly. Rowan stepped forward carefully. "Take off the mask." The masked man slowly lifted a hand to the smooth white surface. But he didn't remove it. Instead, he lowered the blade fully to the ground. Metal scraping softly against stone. "I thought fear would balance it," he said quietly, "if they felt even a fraction." "It doesn't balance," Mara interrupted. Her voice broke for the first time. "It multiplies." The word echoed. Rowan saw it then, not just revenge. Not just ritual. Contagion. The killings hadn't been about Daniel alone. They had been about making the town feel what it felt like to be helpless. To watch. To not act. One lives. One dies next. The pattern wasn't punishment. It was replication. He was recreating the paralysis, forcing others to feel what he had felt. And now, the chain had reached its final link. "You could kill me," Mara said softly. The masked man didn't respond. "You could leave me alive," she continued. "And the fear keeps spreading." Rowan's finger tightened slightly on the trigger. "Or," Mara said, stepping closer to the masked figure, "you can stop." Silence. Not the empty kind. The deciding kind. The masked man's breathing shifted subtly. Behind the mask, something human cracked. "I hear him," he whispered. Mara's eyes filled. "So do I." The words softened the air between them. For 15 years, he had carried Daniel's final sound alone. The gasp. The panic. The splash. But Mara had carried something else. The scream. The futile reach. The guilt of not being strong enough to save him. They were both survivors. Just in different ways. "You don't get to forget," he said quietly. "I won't," she replied. "And they won't either." Rowan took another step forward. "It's done," he said firmly. "Put your hands up." The masked man turned slightly now, just enough for Rowan to see the side of the mask. No rage in the posture. No resistance. Just exhaustion. "I thought justice faded," he said softly. "It does," Mara answered. "But fear isn't justice." He considered that. For a long moment. Then slowly. He removed the mask. Rowan felt his breath leave his body. The face beneath wasn't monstrous. It wasn't scarred. It was painfully ordinary. Mid-30s, hollow-eyed, pale from years spent somewhere unseen. Rowan recognized him faintly. Thomas Lyle, one of the quieter boys in the old yearbooks. Never charged. Never questioned deeply. The boy who had stood closest to the edge. "You were there," Rowan said quietly. "Yes." "And you survived." Thomas nodded once. "He left me on purpose." The phrase shifted shape again. Daniel hadn't spared him. Daniel hadn't chosen him. But survival had marked him anyway. "And you decided to mark them back," Rowan said. "Yes." Mara stepped closer. "But you don't have to mark anyone else." Thomas looked back at the water. "I wanted them to feel it." "They did," she said. The wind stilled. The quarry fell silent again. For the first time since Rowan had arrived, the air didn't feel charged. It felt fragile. Thomas dropped to his knees slowly. Not in surrender. In release. The mask fell from his hand and landed near the water's edge. One lives. One dies next. The chain had ended not with a scream, but with a choice. Rowan moved in carefully, cuffing Thomas without resistance. Mara stood still, staring at the quarry. Daniel's face in her mind. Not drowning. Not gasping. Smiling. The way she wanted to remember him. Hours later, as dawn approached, Bellmere exhaled for the first time in weeks. News spread quickly. Arrest made. Suspect in custody. The killing stopped. People locked doors less tightly that night. Lights turned off earlier. But something lingered. Because fear doesn't vanish when the mask comes off. It settles into memory. At the station, Thomas sat quietly in interrogation. No theatrics. No outbursts. "I wanted them to listen," he said simply. "They did," Rowan replied. Thomas nodded. "But they'll forget." Rowan didn't answer. Because that was the real question. Would they? Outside, Mara stood alone in the pale morning light. Rowan approached her gently. "It's over," he said. She didn't look convinced. "It's paused," she corrected softly. Rowan studied her. "You're not going to continue it." She met his gaze. "No." A long silence passed between them. "You don't get to forget," she whispered again. But this time, it wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Behind them, in an evidence bag on the station counter, the white mask rested under fluorescent light. Still, expressionless, empty. But symbols don't die easily. They wait. And somewhere deep in Bellmere, in homes that had once believed themselves safe, a phrase still echoed quietly in the dark. One lives. One dies next. Chapter 10. The last survivor must choose. Bellmere tried to return to normal. It always does, small towns like this. They repaint fences, replace doors, organize candlelight vigils that feel more like ceremonies for themselves than for the dead. The news vans left first. Then the national headlines. Then the speculation. But fear doesn't pack its bags so neatly. It lingers in reflections. In quiet hallways. In the space between a knock and an answer. Thomas Lyle confessed without resistance. He detailed the quarry, the laughter, the moment Daniel slipped beneath the surface, the silence that followed. "I thought someone would jump in," he said calmly in interrogation. "No one did." Rowan listened without interruption. "You could have," Rowan said finally. Thomas nodded. "Yes. No excuses. No justifications. Just the unbearable weight of survival." He described the years afterward. The town's deliberate amnesia. The way Daniel's name stopped being spoken within months. The way yearbooks quietly removed his photo from memorial sections after graduation. "They erased him," Thomas said. "And you erased them," Rowan replied. Thomas didn't correct him, but something in his expression suggested that wasn't the full truth. Because he hadn't erased them. He had marked them. Left one alive. Every time. Not mercy. Responsibility. Mara visited the quarry alone 2 days after the arrest. The fence still sagged at the back entrance. The water remained black and still. She carried the white mask in a brown evidence envelope Rowan had reluctantly released to her. "It's just latex," he had warned. "No," she'd replied. "It's memory." She stepped to the water's edge. For years she had dreamed of this place. Of confrontation. Of justice delivered in screams. Instead, she felt something quieter. Grief without heat. She held the mask over the water. For a moment, she considered letting it sink. Letting the symbol disappear into the same darkness that had swallowed Daniel. But symbols don't dissolve that easily. If she threw it away, someone else might find it. Wear it. Continue it. One lives. One dies next. The chain had always depended on choice. Thomas had chosen fear. She could choose something else. Mara lowered herself to sit near the edge of the quarry. "You don't get to forget," she whispered. But she wasn't speaking to the town. She was speaking to herself. Because forgetting would be easier. Anger is loud. Fear is contagious. But memory without violence, that takes discipline. Back in Bellmere, people began to speak Daniel's name again. Cautiously at first. In church. In classrooms. Mrs. Alder held a special assembly. She read a passage about accountability. Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. "We cannot erase what we do," she told the students. "We carry it, and we choose what it becomes." Caleb sat in the back row, listening. He had been the first whisper. The first marked survivor in the new chain. He understood something now that he hadn't before. Survival isn't luck. It's weight. And what you do with that weight defines you. That night, Caleb stood in front of his bedroom mirror again. The same mirror where he had once whispered. "He left me on purpose." He stared at his reflection. It stared back without delay this time. No lag. No distortion. "I'm not carrying it for you," he said softly. The words felt important. Not defiant. Just firm. Because the chain required belief. Required participation. Required someone to accept the role of messenger. And Caleb was choosing not to. Across town, Officer Mendez returned to regular patrol. The condensation never reappeared on his mirror. But sometimes, when the house fell silent, he thought he could still hear breathing that wasn't his own. Fear doesn't evaporate. It settles into corners. It becomes caution. And sometimes caution is healthy. Thomas Lyle was transferred to state custody before trial. As officers led him through the corridor, he paused briefly. Rowan stood across from him. "Do you regret it?" Rowan asked quietly. Thomas considered the question carefully. I regret that it didn't bring him back, he said. And the fear, Rowan pressed. Thomas's eyes flickered. It's louder than I thought. Rowan nodded once. Because that was the truth. Fear echoes longer than intention. Weeks later, Bellmere gathered again at Greywater Quarry. Not for violence, not for spectacle, for a memorial. A real one this time. Daniel Vance's name carved into stone. Permanent, unavoidable. People stood in silence. No cameras, no speeches about accidents. Just acknowledgement. Mara placed the white mask at the base of the memorial stone. Not hidden, not destroyed, displayed. A reminder. This is what silence becomes, she said quietly. Rowan stood beside her. You could have continued it, he said. Yes. Why didn't you? She looked out at the water. Because someone has to be the last survivor. The phrase settled deeply. Not the one who lives through violence. The one who ends it. That night, Bellmere slept more peacefully than it had in months. But peace felt different now. Not naive. Not careless. Earned. And in a small evidence locker, the white mask no longer waited. It rested beneath open sky, beside a carved name. A warning. A memory. One lives. One dies next. The phrase still existed. But it no longer felt inevitable. Because the chain had depended on repetition. And repetition can be broken. In her room above the hardware store, Mara sat by the window one final time before leaving town again. She didn't run this time. She simply moved forward. Daniel's photograph rested in her hands. He left me on purpose, she whispered. Not as accusation. Not as fear. But as truth. Survival marks you. It gives you a choice. Spread fear. Or carry memory. She chose memory. And somewhere in Bellmere, in houses once stained by blood, people locked their doors not out of terror, but out of understanding. Because horror doesn't begin with monsters. It begins with silence. And it ends only when someone refuses to stay quiet.
Closing chapter.
He never needed to kill everyone. That was never the point. Death is fast. Death is quiet. But fear spreads. Fear lingers. Fear turns neighbors into suspects and survivors into prisoners. This town thought the horror was a masked man with a knife. But the real horror was the chain. The whisper passed from trembling lips to terrified ears. One lives. One dies next. And the message is always delivered. So ask yourself something tonight. If he leaned close to you, if he whispered a name, would you run? Would you warn them? Or would you stay silent and hope the chain skips you? Because in this story, survival isn't mercy. It's a responsibility. And now that you've heard it, the message has already been delivered.